problem. I mean, I don't mind teaching it. Okay, very good. I'm going to sit. I like to stand and see everybody nicely, but let me chair over just. All right. So we are middle of discussing how the reform movement grew in the 19th century. Obviously, from an Orthodox perspective, this really split the Jewish community. So, depending on, I read a lot of sources, so if it's a very Orthodox person who's writing the history, be extremely negative. I try to find a middle ground, so it's people who aren't quite so, so much to the right. Um, and as a lot of this is coming from actually Grayzel's book, History of the Jews. There's another uh, more moderate history of the Jews by a man called Johnson. I don't happen to own that, but you know that it's more recent. Grayzel's is an older publication. Um, but like I looked at, obviously I always look at Rabbi Wine's book, but I think you have to be careful with the terms and words you use. First of all, you never know who else might be reading it. Not necessarily everybody, buys into, you know, your frame of reference. Um, so as I say, I want you to understand, as I say, from our perspective, this was a terrible thing that happened, huge schism, and really thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands thronged the reform movement, and it really made a huge thing in the traditional Judaism. But Lakafstachus, you have to judge everybody favorably. Why were they doing this? Why did they feel they needed to make all these radical changes in our davening, even our daily lives? They, yes, they wanted to fit in, but there was another reason. There was this huge wave, when they couldn't get all their emancipation rights. Um, and this was especially after the Napoleonic Wars, where things had opened up for them. Then the Napoleon was defeated, and so many rights and opening of the ghetto, was now, reverted back. This is a time of uh, especially after the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Um, and many Jews, they had this like little glimpse of an opening in their lives. And now they were so upset. So, and so many of them converted to Christianity. So this was reform's answer to prevent people from leaving Judaism completely. Now we know that ultimately, I mean, at a certain point it was so watered down that there was not that much difference, unfortunately, sometimes between the practice, I'm not saying the substance, but the practices uh, uh, were sort of, nullified. And this was their effort to stem the assimilation, the intermarriage, and not only that, but the conversions to Christianity. And this might have been from Rabbi Wine's book that I saw this, that like 250,000 Jews, converted to Christianity. I think I know. I was flabbergasted when I saw that number. It just, again, I don't know what his source is, so I'm not sure. But regardless, there was a huge, huge number, the Jewish fold. It's interesting. At some point, I'll discuss certain, well-known individuals whose families had converted to Christianity, but nobody lets you forget it. And even they still identify themselves as Jews, even if they weren't practicing, Jews anymore at that time. I wanted to remember I mentioned last time that there were these salons, were gatherings of these intellectuals and with the Christians and Jews. So I wanted to read you. I found this book. And obviously, you see the color. I've owned it for a while. Okay. It's called The Course of Modern Jewish History. And remember, I told you some of the people, just the men who would flock to these fancy salons, they were run by the women of the house. They were very well educated. So I wanted to read you about two women from that class, that very wealthy class who ran these salons and how they felt about their Jewish. Um, there's a woman, Henrietta Hertz. She was the wife of a prominent Berlin physician, and she was a woman of tact, intelligence, beauty, and perception. But she lacked peace of mind. Her desire to win full acceptance in German society amounted virtually to an obsession. Um, uh, she came very close to that goal. I told you all these various important, Christian personages would come to her gatherings. Um, I'm not even going to mention all their names. All her visitors flattered her, fawned over, expressed wonderment that a woman of her cultivation could remain loyal to Judaism. In 1817, Henrietta Hertz finally yielded to a prevailing fashion of the day and accepted baptism into the Protestant faith. All right. Here's another woman. Her name is Rachel, right? Rachel, I don't know how to pronounce it. Levin. Her home was a meeting place for the most original minds in Germany. And it was startlingly brilliant salon. Her ability to discern new talent was uncanny. She, for example, was the first to introduce Goethe, right? He's very famous German. Goethe, as you pronounce it, okay. And Reinke, I have heard of his name, but I'm not as familiar with him, to the literary world. A veritable Rachel cult flourished throughout her life. She was called extravagantly the most gifted woman of the universe, the first modern woman of German culture. But none of all these praises brought her any happiness. Ooh, how loathsomely degrading, she wrote to a friend. How offensive and low are my surroundings, which I cannot avoid. A mere contact sullies me, disturbs my nobility. And that defilement was her Jewishness. She felt, being associated with the Jews, was tainting her. Okay, now in 1814, at the age of 43, she married a 30-year-old Christian writer and diplomat. You don't need it. And she was baptized a Lutheran the same day. So you can see, right, away from Judaism. They wanted so much to be part of that culture. And so we're going to pick up this sheet, and then we'll go into the next thing of some of the earlier, very well-known German Reform rabbis and how they wanted to put a philosophical bent, probably to legitimize their reason for leaving Orthodoxy and forming, these congregations. So I'll start at the top of page 2. Okay. Okay. So I am still reading from what we had done last week. We had included, right, the Reform movement in Germany, 19th century. I'm not up to, no, the one before. That's why I wrote continued on the second one, because I'm still describing the saga. Yeah, well, it's called the Reform movement. So it's called the Reform movement in Germany, 19th century. 2, and we're on page 2. Okay, if not, you can just listen. The Jews of Germany took very seriously the argument that they were too different in manners and customs to be considered the equals of Christian Germans. I mean, do you care so much? Okay, but no, they did. I mean, there's certain elements that did bother them. Jews were considered to be weird and outlandish, and Judaism was called a relic of a dead Asiatic civilization. What does this have to do with modern Europe? Things are expanding and opening up, and this is a period of enlightenment. And how are these Jews still clinging to these outdated, laws and customs? A number of the more loyal Jews became convinced that the stigma of outlandishness must be removed from Judaism. Again, so they These are the Jews. These are the early Reformed Jews. They do not want to convert to Christianity. They still have a modicum of respect, obviously, for traditional Judaism, but they feel a tremendous need to revise it, to modernize it, so that it would be more acceptable to the regular German. This would stem the outward flow of conversions and also refute the arguments against emancipation. Because the Germans, were saying at this, remember, actionary time period, and the Germans are, first they were sort of, because of Napoleon, were in certain areas of Germany were granted rights, but now they've rescinded them. So they want to make sure that they are positioned as equal citizens, in Germany would be accepted by all. So they felt one of the major criticisms was, oh, well, you're so old fashioned, you're still clinging, to your outmoded manner of speech and prayer, et cetera, et cetera. And so, as I said, to prevent people though, from completely leaving the Jewish fold, they came up with this idea. Well, let's reform from within, and that's why we're going to keep these Jews still, loyal to us. A start was made early in the 19th century in the Western German province of Westphalia, while it was still under French occupation. So you see this huge French influence, right? So it became more conservative than where eastward would go. So like Berlin, for example, is, more easterly, if you look at a map of Germany, but Westphalia, this is right on the with France. Um, Israel Jacobson, he's the first person who I want to introduce to you, and what he did, he was sort of right. The most prominent Jew of that province and the leader of its consistory. I mean, I told you the Jews, everybody's divided up in different, groupings. Introduce a number of changes into the synagogue ritual. All of the Hebrew prayers were to be recited in German. Okay, so it's a few. But look at this, a mixed choir and instrumental music. So this is, when an organ is going to introduce to make it like a church. Yes. Oh, they had no more. Oh. And a sermon in German was to be part of the ritual. I remember my father telling me. So the original show in Harrisburg was what we call downtown. It was close to the capital. Harrisburg's the capital. Um, and when he became the Rav there, early 1930s, so he gave the sermon in Yiddish. But eventually, a lot of the congregants answered, could you give it in English? So for sure, I think he started changing already when the show was still downtown, but then they moved uptown. I mean, those of you who come from New York, you're touching more, you're going to see, words I'm using, but if you're some smaller town in America, that's how things were divided. By the time I moved to Uptown, which I think the Cornerstone says 1948, for sure, his sermons, were all English. Just a cute little story. So my father, I guess, used to take my oldest sister to show with him, even when it was still downtown, pretty long walk. And he was giving his sermon. All of a sudden, he feels a tug of his pants. And my sister's like 3 years old. When are you going to be finished? I guess it was like funny, but it was embarrassing. When right, we see how there's lots of changes in the ritual that are being used at this time. Now, this man, Israel Jacobson, his years were 1768 to 1828. He was actually a very wealthy man. He's from a fairly well-off family, but then he really improved on their finances. So he then became a philanthropist. He was a communal organizer. He believed in the idea of religious pluralism. That we should all live in this beautiful society. We're all going to get along. Whatever, minor differences are like. We're all one big people. So, like, we're all German. Well, I can't help you. Everybody else seems to have found it. I told you it's the reform movement in Germany. Now, that's the one that we're going to be doing. Okay, so I'm on that, I guess, the third paragraph or the second paragraph, where you want to look at it. He also introduced, I read this, so every source tells you something else. So they said that he also introduced the practice of confirmation. I think they do it on Shavuos, where it's confirmation. I don't know if it's for the boys and the girls, but like your big welcome. I mean, I think in the Christian church they also have a thing. Uh, we have a little quiet. Thank you. Okay. Next, the last paragraph on that page. When conditions in Westphalia, again, put in the T, changed, Jacobson moved to Berlin, okay, which is a very much more open society, and carried his ideas with him. So it's a very large community. So it's a big up, for him to have now, been offered a position there. The established synagogues were not open to introducing these reforms. It's so orthodox. So a group of wealthy Jews organized services in private homes. One of these homes was that of Jacob Hertz Beer, the father of the composer Meyerbeer. This was the period when reaction was at its height. All change, religious as well as political, was under suspicion. Some fanatics among the Jews resorted to calling upon the government of Prussia to come to their aid to compel the discontinuance of the new service. I always feel, do not get involved with the ruling authorities against another group in Judaism. Bad news, because you see, it's going to turn against them. And the reformer are going to grow, and then there'll be kebabs put on the Orthodox, but it's the Orthodox who started this, to turn to the government. If you can't control your own Jews within your own midst, don't ask an outside source, to come in. Anyway, that's a big shame, I say. However, on the very last page, once again, the movement could not be so easily stopped. In the freer atmosphere of Hamburg, a building was set up, and two men with rabbinic training and modern culture were engaged as preachers. This was in the year 1816. The service was modeled on the service of the Berlin Conference, with an organ, a few German prayers, and some modifications of the Hebrew prayers to remove all expressions of hope for the Mashiach and the restoration of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, they would to say, oh, we don't no longer have this the desire to return. We're very happy here in Germany, and we, want to be accepted as equal citizens as all other German people living. And also, you have to remember, these Jews have been living there for hundreds of years. I mean, it wasn't like that they're total newcomers to the country. They changed it now. What's that? Yeah, it's been changed. Even the name synagogue was given up in favor of the name temple. The word synagogue stirred up ghetto memories. And that would be the word shul. Right? They didn't like that. First of all, it's Yiddish. And, they weren't calling them the Knesset, but they called them the shul. And stood for all that Christianity had bitter maligned. Everything that they're doing that old-fashioned way, this is what the Christians have been railing about. Almost only the Jews would change themselves. Obviously, they wanted them to come into the Christian. All would be good. So, did it help during the Holocaust? Gornish. All right. Yes, right. No, shtetls are Poland and Russia. This has nothing to do with them. This is Germany. You wouldn't call a small town in Germany a shtetl. It was a village. With the word temple, the Jews thought they could make a new start. As I say, have they done Kol Adam L'Kaf I think that their intentions on a certain level were good because they wanted to stem the tide of so many, thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands who were converting to Christianity, and they wanted to keep them within the Jewish fold. So they made sense. Oh, so let's modernize ourselves, and therefore, we will now be acceptable to the bulk of the German population, but we will still have a vestige of our religion. We're not going to change. Now, it is in the United States. Well, it's very different. On the other hand, Reform Judaism is going to spread. It's not going to be just in Germany, and true, it will also go to England. Well, that will be a little later date. It's going to so in Western and Central Europe, be considered Central Europe, reform will find a foot. And it will find, now here in the wonderful United States, tons and tons of Jews became reformed. They also didn't want, and there was no problem. They had equal rights, had nothing to do with it. They just wanted to be more like a non-Jew. And they left the Orthodox fold and they opened up these various reform congregations. It was, like all over the U.S. Now, the U.S. is not so large at this point. Talking about post the War of Independence, 1776, but in those early 1830s, 1840s, that's when a lot of congregations in America became reformed. I'll talk a little bit about it. Okay, so now we're continuing the same thing. The storm of protest which arose among the opponents of reform served merely to solidify the ranks on both sides. I will, at a later point, I try to keep things in like units. So I will at some point talk more about some of the Rabbanim, obviously Orthodox Rabbanim who opposed the spread of reform, and there was a lot of animosity, between the two groups. Listen, I can remember my Zeta is in Cincinnati already at this point, having a huge with a reform rabbi because he wanted to have a new mitzvah bill. And it actually was brought to a court of law. Yes. And the judge voted in favor of my Zeta. Who are these other people? Said you can't build a mikvah. I mean, it was land legally bought and et cetera, et cetera. And I know my father in 1943 founded, I think it's one of the very earliest, about the earliest day schools in America, in a small town. Harrisburg is only 5,000 Jews, but he saw the necessity, how important Jewish education is. And boy, did the reform, they were very much in favor of public school. What's this? You're going to have, this simply a Jewish school. It was like anathema, terrible thing in their eyes. And they put up a big things. And my day school that I went to was actually housed in the JCC, and which is highly unusual. But he got enough community support. The conservative Jews at that point were more to the right, so they helped back it, but the reform really. But he always kept good relations. I remember Rabbi Bookstaber, that was his name, before Rabbi, coming to my house, sometimes. They always have to try to make it as possible, but still sticking to your own beliefs, not making them, like trying to nullify. Be proud of who you are and where you stand. Okay. The storm of protests which arose among the opponents of reform, served merely, to solidify the ranks on both sides. The reformers continued to spread their views with missionary fervor. I mean, look how many thousands of Jews flocked to them. They organized a model reform service in Leipzig so that the Jews who came there twice a year to attend, just remove that number to attend, I might have removed it on yours because I went back and fixed it up. Okay. To attend the famous fair might be inspired to emulate this example when they returned home. So there they introduced nice introduction. Many Jews came to the fair. Uh, Now, oh, come to our service, see how you like it. This is obviously did. And then the idea was that they should go back to their own towns and right, and establish reform congregations. The reformers also exerted polite influence on various local governments. I think for polite. Thus, the government Weimar was induced to insist on the introduction of German into the synagogue service. Within a short time, the influence of the reformers spread far and wide beyond the borders of Germany. Just to point this out, so I hope you understand this and recognize the conservative movement was an American uh, movement, a way to compromise between the Orthodox and the Reform. Now, you will find in Israel they call it Masorati, and that's because a lot of conservative Jews, have moved to Israel and they have well, we don't want to go to also strictly right wing Orthodox schools. We want more open conversation. And notice how they went to the government again. Now it's going to turn against. You went to the government to try to, close down all our reform congregations. Hey, now we're going to get the government involved to put the cops on you. And it's really pretty ugly what's going on. Echoes of reform were soon heard in England and France, and even in the United States. We were, so many Jews here were open for it. In 1824, a group of Jews in Charleston, South Carolina, petitioned the board of their congregation to introduce the German reforms into their service. When the petition was rejected, they seceded and organized a reform congregation of their own. And numerous communities in the United States proved to be fertile soil for these new growing ideas. Now, just picture, if you will, the U.S. And we're mostly on the East Coast, all right? People have not really sold where someone here on the coast, but most are on the East Coast. So the major congregations would have been New York, Philadelphia, in Boston, and Savannah. It's interesting. And Richmond also, had this, not because of Shalom. I know more about the Spanish Portuguese Jewish communities. So just like he is on this journey to visit every Spanish Portuguese congregation in America. So they're even listed in Bibles, like Bible, and they talked about these old congregations in Charleston and in Savannah. So when you're down here, if you have a chance, it's like 8-9 hours to get to Charleston, but there are only 2 hours between Charleston and Savannah. So you could make, I would say you need at least a 3-day trip because you're so far. But you can visit these, because they were originally Spanish Portuguese congregations, because those were the Jews who first came. Remember, the British, right, took over from the Dutch. They got in 1664. So then a lot of English Jews from those parts, social, started coming over to America to seek their fortune. And they opened up congregations based, like on Douglas Mar, as the section of the very large Spanish Portuguese school in Amsterdam. And then each of those schools would have helped out these new communities, with their prayer books, with the Toad School, and sending them chatanim, to lead the congregation. But again, in 1840, things are here, saying in 1830s, things are changing. So you can go, again, if you take a visit to Charleston and to Savannah. Now, in Charleston, I went into that congregation called Beit Elohim. Yes, and you can see how it's arranged. It's very similar to a Spanish Portuguese show. But there is an organ way in the back, up in what we would use as a women's factory, right? There is an organ there. And obviously the service is a reformed service. So Sholem at one point made contact with the rabbi, who was a woman of that congregation, but things didn't pan out. I mean, he had hoped to maybe go there and make a Friday night Orthodox, like the original Spanish Portuguese way of davening. No, it didn't work. So, and I think it would have been fascinating for the people who lived there because it was a very beautiful, tradition. Um, but who knows if they would have accepted this stuff? I mean, who knows? All kinds of complications. Um, and there is an Orthodox shul in that older area of Charleston, but it's this reform, which is much larger, and now they're out in the suburbs of sort of a multitude. There's an Orthodox, and I'm sure many other types of congregations, right, all over the place. Um, so when you go into the building, it's that traditional feel about it. But if you go to Savannah, Georgia, that's what I'm saying, very proud of their Spanish Portuguese roots. If you go to Savannah, which is like 6 hours from here, but you have to understand, Savannah is very close to 95. Charleston's almost an hour to the east of 95. That's why it takes so long to drive there. Uh, the synagogue in Savannah was a church. Again, they are very, very proud of their Spanish Portuguese heritage, and they have, both these schools have museums. Go to they have like Torah scrolls, dating back a few hundred years. Um, but this was designed obviously by an architect, church architecture, so it really, if somebody didn't tell you it was a synagogue, you would think in a church, the nave and I don't know, as things went, windows, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think it's interesting. But even though, as I say, they are Reformed congregations today, they still take great pride in their, his Spanish faith. Um, this is so interesting. So I was talking to Andrea, because she belongs to a Reformed congregation here in Boca. She said nowadays the organ is not played, and a lot of Reformed congregations they eliminate. Probably. Well, otherwise, why would there be an organ in the synagogue? Right. So there's an organ, obviously, that one in Savannah as well. And if you go to these shuls, they had docents, guides, to talk. The one big mistake they all made is they make it sound like the Jews who first came and established this congregation, they were speaking Ladino. That's just totally false. I hope none of you ever make this mistake. Ladino is the language of the Jews from the Ottoman Empire. These were Spanish, Portuguese, Jews. Yeah, I know what the language is. Right, right. But these were Jews coming from Portugal, and so if anything, some of their very, very old Siddurim would have had Portuguese, written in them. If you go to their cemeteries, they are the stones are in Portuguese. So very, very good. But Ladino was not spoken by these Western foreigners. They did not. These were speaking, they were, coming from England, and now they were Americans and speaking English. And nobody was forcing them to change. They wanted to change. So that's the difference between some of the European countries, and meaning the United States. That's other thousands very Catholic. Okay, let's go on to the next paragraph. The violent quarrels. They were pretty nasty. And the name calling, which accompanied the spread of the reform ideas during the first generation of the movement, so I'm talking about the earlier 1800s, could not continue without each side developing justifications for it. Now we're going to have a philosophical base, without just like, oh, we need to change, things are archaic, we need to become more modern, we want to show that we are truly loyal, to the countries in which we live. But now, there need to be some philosophical underpinnings, the reasons that explain their desire for change. The practical consideration of meeting the Christian charge that the Jews were too different gave way to more scholarly explanation of the need for change within Judaism. In a way, it's like double, you know, like they took all these Christian arguments like to heart, and instead of trying to defend themselves and their beliefs, they made such an effort to try to fit in. The leadership of the second generation of reformers saw their problems in religious and philosophical terms. The Orthodox, put on the intellectual defensive, also brought forth arguments more worthy of Judaism than excommunication. I mean, what are you going to put in Karen, everybody? It's like pretty big effect. And, and also the ugliness of appealing to these reactionary governments, to try to close down these foreign congregations. I told you a boomerang on it because more by 1860, the governments were actually backing the reform movement. I mean, these are the majority, and they dressed and looked like other Germans. So they were more acceptable to the government than those. And the reform movement after 1830 produced on both sides men and ideas which lifted the level of the discussion to a higher plane. So now we're going to have, you have heard of some of these rabbis, both on the Orthodox and the Reform thing. And again, they're going to be writing out, giving a justification for why they want to change or they don't want to change. The new ideas themselves created a problem. Each rabbi, whether he leaned towards Orthodox or Reform, advocated his own ideas on Judaism. So it's not quite yet a unified front. Everybody's giving their bent on the problem. He then drew from them, trying to explain the reasons for the change, his own conclusion for change, which he considered to be necessary. This threatened chaos in Jewish life, where previously there had been close unity. I mean, to me, when I look at this period, I mean, really up until this time, we were all one people. We died in the same way. You were working into another, and so, and here there's been a big demarcation. It was therefore thought desirable to call a conference of the more modern rabbis in order to discover some measure of common action that could be achieved. All right. So listen, instead of you saying we should do this, and saying that, let's have a conversation. We will discuss everything with a unified approach. However, the conferences called between 1844 and 1846 did not attain the desired unity. Now we're talking at this point about the reformers. They're the ones calling these various conferences. It soon became clear that the new religious leadership of the German Jews contained four distinct points of view. I would say that there actually were more. I will prepare for you for next week. I saw there were like four rabbis who I listed here, but there were some other great rabbis from the country. Now, the reform, these are the thinkers. Okay. Farthest apart in their attitudes were two influential men, Samuel Holstein and Samson Raphael Hirsch. So you all heard of him. Holstein, who had received a thorough rabbinic training in an East European yeshiva. So this was a guy who went, but he's going to turn away from it. He subsequently became the rabbi of the Reform, a congregation of Berlin. Okay, now that was very, prior to that, he had been an older, not the online. And you can see his dates there, 1806, 1860. Is that what it is? Okay. He was actually besides being obviously learned, right? in basic Judaism and having studied in yeshiva for many years. He also went to the University of Leipzig and had a degree from there. So he's interested in learning about the world, gaining secular knowledge. Okay. He was in favor of the most extreme reform. He went like Baltashubanists. They come from a background where they haven't been observing anything. And boy, then they decided, right, and then he came and talked to them. All right. He argued that religion was an instrument developed by man. So this is a negation of Torah Sinai, no longer saying that we receive the Torah in God, but that it's man, like man can for the purpose of improving the nature of mankind and human society. Well, if you don't have a divine backing, so why should you follow any specific law? Like all instruments, it requires constant adjustment to new conditions. The traditions of Judaism, theology, and practice might have been suitable to the past, but they were now outgrown and outmoded. Judaism must be modified and recast completely to fit the new age. Man's intelligence, not condition, must be. Oldham had but a meager following in his own day, because he, lived in an earlier period and in later Germany. However, the influence of his ideas had a strong impact in the new and growing United States. And I told you how the reform, made tremendous inroads, into a lot of communities. Um, he felt there was a distinction between religion and the nation. Not to identify himself as a Jew because of religion, but we are part of the national scene. We are as German as anybody living in anyone else. We're as English as anyone. Obviously the U.S. or as American as any. He is reformed. He's not different. Yes, 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 yes. The one thing, it's interesting, I had read again, I told you I looked at a lot of different sources. They said he was actually, they give, credit to him that he's the pioneer in the field of modern Jewish homiletics. That's a speech, you give a sermon, to, a more polished way, presenting the material, not the old fashioned, you know, manner. I mean, nowadays, perhaps we're more used to the more modern things. I mean, our rabbis give our sermons, you know. I have no idea what it would be like a Haredi community. I don't think they have sermons. They'll give a seer, maybe, either earlier or after. And they don't really have sermons. My husband had one rug in YU. He called it sermonic dishwater. Dishwater. I guess he didn't like listening to sermons. Well, that's a big thing for them to meet on Friday night. But we're in a Reformed temple. Uh, okay. Yeah, but no women are for the guys. All right. Now let's talk about Samson. There's another one who I will mention that. I think his name is Bamberger, who was also from the Orthodox field, but he disagreed with Samson Raphael Hirsch on one key point. But again, I can't introduce too many things. It's confusing. All right, so they all live at the same time. They're all smack in the middle of that 19th century. So he was born in 1808, died in the year 1888. He held quite the opposite view. Not that we need to modify Judaism, and like man, with his intelligence, don't make the decisions as what changes are needed. He argued that God's revelation of the Torah on Mount Sinai was a fact, right? Torah Sinai. And without Torah, there was not a fear to the mitzvot. What are you? You're nothing. You're a shell. And no change dared be made. Man's intelligence could not measure itself against the divine. It was a bold presumption for any generation to set itself up as a possessor of wisdom superior to God's expression. You also understand a lot of these early reform rabbis, well, probably, I don't know what it's like now, but they rejected all what was Judaism. They didn't study the oral law. I mean, they looked upon the, as being the Torah as being something that's very enlightened in its day, but that it was created by man, and therefore they had the right as men of intelligence to make changes to fit into their modern age. Um, First argued against the slightest change in Jewish tradition. A true Jew must retain his beliefs and customs of Israel in their every detail. Now, they're making him out to be like almost extremist. I mean, we always hear these things, what to say, but the way, Brazil, giving us this information. So you have to think, I like a historian who sticks to the facts and explains it, and Rabbi One, God bless him, I love his books too, but they're very much, obviously to the Orthodox slant. This man trying to keep the middle road, and there are other sources that you see that, and make use of. So that's why I think it's very important. Not yet, correct. He's going to come into this, but not quite yet. Um, oh no, this is Great Zell, which is put out. I don't know if it's still available. Put out by James was put out. I don't know what. And he was, I would say, he's a very moderate. I have to look up. I'm not sure where he stood religiously, but he's highly respectful of the observant Jews. Now, if you read Heinrich Gretz, who's going to come out of the same time period, oh my God, I think it's something else. He hated them. I mean, describes them in the most ugly, ugly fashion, and some sort of embarrassment to read. Because again, as a historian, you're supposed to take some sort of useful things, but not him when it came to it. On the other hand, he's great explaining Jewish history, prior to this time period. Actually, he gave him. I remember learning. I don't know. This is probably taught, but he has a wonderful, probably several chapters explaining how Christianity, Judaism, and the differences of the religions. Hey, so right. So, but he was definitely a modern. He was not. Hirsch was so powerful a writer, which is he came out with several publications, preacher and leader of men, that he won back to orthodoxy the important Jewish community in Frankfurt am Main, which had, had a large Reform congregation. But I guess, as I said, he was a very eloquent speaker. Obviously, the people there probably still have leanings towards Orthodoxy, and he was actually able to bring them back. This community in the 1840s had been a stronghold of radical reform. Now, let me just tell you, there's a lot more to say about Samson Raphael Hirsch, and I those people from the German Jewish community in Washington Heights. These are the descendants of the kind of physical descendants, philosophical descendants, and the school of Royers, right? There's Rabbi Schwab. Do you remember all this? They had and they definitely followed. And I'll tell you some of the things he wrote. I'll explain a little bit more about them in the future. And by the way, he was friends with Heinrich Gretz. And Gretz actually, he's known as like I would say, the foremost or one of the early beginnings Jewish historiographer. He actually lived in Hirsch's home for a few years. But then obviously they parted ways afterwards. He wrote his first thing that he wrote and published was called 19 Letters on Judaism, in which he tries to refute the reform argument and propose the big proponent of the Orthodox, the traditional way of Judaism. He also, there's another Robert who I'm going to elaborate more upon him next time. There was this Rabbi Isaac Bill Bamberger, Orthodox rabbi, also obviously opposed to reform, but differences of opinion stands from Rafal Hirsch. Um, he then wrote a book called Horeb, which is apparently like a textbook on Judaism. And then he's very famous, certainly nowadays, his commentary on Chumash is also well considered. And I've used when I taught, it's a Chumash, he's not like a whole, but he a beautiful commentary, you know. And I learned a lot of interesting insight, you know, coming from a modern, you know, German world. Again, this is a man who's well educated, and he has a beautiful way of looking at the words in the book. He founded this thought, which is this derech, which is called Torah im derech eretz. That you need to have, you know, Torah, but behavior and actions, you know. He's called like almost like a father of neo, which means neo orthodoxy, right? Not like those older European rabbis. He's a bit more modern, but still within the Orthodox fold. Um, he was a rabbi for a number of years in Moravia. You know, that's Eastern Czechoslovakia. Then from 1847 to 1851, and then he went right to Frankfurt am Main, where he became so well known. He himself studied at the University of Bonn. I told you he himself had a secular education. And he also had published a periodical magazine called Yeshurun, in which other people were too, but he was so, you know. I see we're already getting a little later, so I'm going to continue this right on page 3. If you want to believe it, page 3. So we'll continue this. I will next week give you additional information of some of the Rabbanim at this same time period, the Orthodox Rabbanim, and their writings and attitudes for reform. All right. So, hope you enjoyed this. Not very much myself to do this, and but I spoke, by the way, yes. When I spoke to Andrea, so she said reform today has moderated itself kind of. Uh, you know, I beginning of the reform is one of the other things. Germany, yeah, Germany. So they were over loyal to the what we have to find ourselves. And now they come around 20th century. Reform? No. The fourth member, more conservative is much diminished. But the reform, no, they're always pretty strong. You know, listen, I come from a small town. There was an Orthodox shul. I think there was a little Hasidic. Machazike Hadas. I don't know. What? Oh no, this is way before. This is way before. I'm talking about the 1950s. I was a little girl. There were two conservative congregations. I can't remember most of the Jews were one liberal and one right? No, closer and stuff. No. Oh, but the Reform Temple would have been founded by German Jews. Yeah, definitely. And Olaf Scholem. So, and I remember this about him. I don't remember him. And but eventually, what happened was, you know, my father was the senior rabbi. You know, like some of these older rabbis retired and younger men, they would all turn to my father for like advice and guidance. You know, not religious, you know, but just how to deal with communal affairs. Yeah. So whatever. Let me turn this off and we can. Bye, anybody who's listening. Okay. Do this.